Tonight we're here to celebrate Fairest, a memoir. It's the debut by Meredith Talusan. Fairest is a memoir about an albino boy who left a rural Philippine village as a young adult and grew up to become a woman in America. Rawia Kamir, writing in the New York Times, says Talusan sails past the conventions of trans and immigrant memoirs. Rather than flaying her identities one by one, she examines the links between them to illustrate that it is here in the messy overlap that a person is made, and then goes on to say there's enough material in Talusan's life story to fill several memoirs. With Meredith in conversation is Jennifer Finney Boylan. Professor Boylan is the author of 15 books, the inaugural Anna Quindlen Writer in Residence at Barnard College of Columbia University. Her column, Men and Women, appears on the op-ed page of the New York Times on alternate Wednesdays. She serves on the board of trustees of PEN America, the nonprofit advocating for authors, readers, and freedom of expression. From 2011 to 2018, she served on the board of directors of GLAAD. She was co-chair of GLAAD's board of directors from 2013 to 2017. She's also a member of the faculty of the Breadloaf Writers Conference of Middlebury College and the Sirenland Writers Conference in Positano, Italy. Meredith Talusan is an award-winning author and journalist who's written for The Guardian, The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, Wired, Self, and Condé Nast Traveler, among many other publications, and has contributed to several essay collections. She's received awards from GLAAD, the Society of Professional Journalists, and the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association. She's also the founding executive editor of THEM, Condé Nast LGBTQ+ digital platform, where she is currently contributing editor. For those of you who are watching at home, if you have questions for the authors at any point throughout the program, please add them in the comments and we'll be sure to pass them along. We will have time for a Q&A session at the end of the program. Thank you all so much for joining us. Meredith and Jennifer, I will turn it over to you. Thank you both for being here tonight.
Thanks, Evan. And hi, Meredith.
Hi, Jenny.
How are you doing, darling?
I'm good now that you're here. I'm really looking forward to.
Oh, we're both here. Oh wait, oh sorry.
Conversation. Yes. Does this doggy have a name?
What dog do you mean, Meredith? I just want to start off by sending out a big virtual hug to you and for this great book, Fairest, and it's worth everyone who's listening understanding that the book is now available, and we're hoping that tonight you'll purchase it through Booksmith, our sponsors. It's booksmith.com, which I believe there's going to be a link, which Evan is shortly to post up in the chats section of this conversation. And if you don't see it there, certainly booksmith.com is going to take you right to the store. And you might have to, I'm hoping Fairest is right up top, but if it's not, it's easy enough to find. It's one word, it's Fairest. It's a great title and it describes this amazing book, Meredith's debut. So how does it feel to have a book out?
It feels good. Especially having had so much feedback from you in terms of signing and inspiration.
Oh yeah, what was my advice about what to do on book tour?
Yeah, you gave me advice about kind of like how to dedicate my books.
Oh right, how to sign a book. Well, of course.
on Twitter and like what to expect, and yeah, so so everything from that perspective has been really wonderful. Of course, like we're living in really challenging times in various ways, and I think and that's something that we've all had to improvise as we've dealt with the pandemic, as well as this reckoning that we're experiencing right now around racism and anti-Blackness. And I think, like for me, that has been one of the harder things, is that I've had, I have less energy than I otherwise would have to sort of engage because of the fact that I'm also simultaneously promoting a book. So, there are those balances. But otherwise, in terms of the book itself and, you know, and just having, you know, people reach out to me, reading, you know, reading reviews, et cetera, all of that has been really wonderful. And I get, you know, like I get to talk to writers that I admire, you know, like that's one of the things that I said was that I would have probably, had I known about this aspect of it, that like now I can just be like, you know, I can just email or, you know, or reach out to writers who I love and just be like, oh, you know, like I wrote this book. It's much more likely for them to
Yeah, it's funny.
I would have probably done this sooner.
Yeah. So I mean, it'll be interesting to see what this particular turn of events does, by which I mean COVID and having us all kind of stuck at home, what that does to the publishing industry and to the idea of the traditional author tour. Because right. I mean, so not to talk about me for too long, although it is my favorite topic. As you probably know, I also had a book that came out this April.
Amazing. I mean, Good Boy is...
Oh, Good Boy. But if I had a copy, I'd hold it up here, but it doesn't seem to be right.
I listened to it on audio, so I don't have a copy myself.
Oh, wait, I've got a copy of the audiobook. Wait, hang on. Yeah, here it is. Now available from Celadon. Anyway, so I was on book tour for Good Boy, which is a memoir of masculinity as told through the medium of the 7 dogs that I owned pre-transition. And, you know, traditionally that, you know, my publisher will, you know, send me around the country where I'll meet, you know, 100 people on a good night, but on a normal night, sometimes like 20 people in a bookstore in Milwaukee, which is on the one hand, really cool, and how great it is to always to meet readers. But also, you know, I also have to think Random House, of course, Random House didn't publish Good Boy, now available from Macmillan Celadon, but Random House, which published my other books, I always wonder, is it really in your financial best interest to send me all the way out here and to have me like drinking martinis in a hotel to talk to 20 So I mean, I've done these events. I know you've done lots of events so far. And one of the things that happens in, you know, writer events is that, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, you know, tune in. And in some case, you know, I had one I did with a pop star named Sia, who might know. I did a thing with Sia. There were thousands of people. And, you know, I did it from my living room. So that was cool. I don't know. But more seriously, I think I want to make sure that you do a reading somewhat early in our conversation. But I also want to see. I think let's have the difficult conversation first, because I think it's you know, it's the conversation that I think is demanded that we have. So your book Fairest, which once again I'll say amazing. Just an incredible debut. It's like you've been publishing. I can't believe this is your first book. It's just so. It's full of insight. It's full of truth, but it's also full of poetry. And the thing, you know, I'll read anything that has trance on the cover, even if it's on the back cover. But the thing about Fairest is that it's literature. You know, it's a testament to the struggle of our people. If you'll pardon me saying our people. It's a testament to where we are historically in the fight for justice, but it's also, I mean, it's poetry. It's just the language itself. And as an English teacher, that's one of the things that really blew me away. Anyway, so it's, among other things, a book about race. It's a book about color. And so I'm not quite sure how to get in here, but what I'm curious is what it's like to have a book about a trans life of a trans woman of color out right now, and also you're kind of a very different kind of trans woman of color, right? Absolutely. So could you talk about some of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that one of the most challenging aspects of the identities that I hold is that I often, like I often feel everything, or like feel the struggles of, like of both in terms of race, right? Like of both, because of the fact that people perceive me often as white, and I move through the world being perceived as white. Like in the conversations where, like where white people are struggling to deal with like their histories of complicity with anti-Blackness, the ways in which we're privileged in various situations, like I talked on Twitter about the fact that I was once late for a flight, and I burst into tears, and there was this white woman who like let me cut through the line in order for me to get to my flight on time. And it was only when I was, on the plane that I thought to myself, oh, like would that have interaction gone completely differently had I been more visibly brown and trans, right? Like that's just kind of like a concrete example.
For people who are just joining the conversation, who don't know anything about you, could you talk about your background, the Philippines, being of albino background? Could you talk about all of that and how it affects both how race is read by strangers in your presence and how that affects your view of the world?
Yeah, I grew up in a rural part of the Philippines. I am albino, so I have no European blood. My entire family is dark-haired and dark-skinned. And I immigrated to the States at 15, but also when I was growing up, my family was aware that my maternal grandfather was living in the US, and we were planning to move to the US. So from a very, very early age, I was being prepared to assume this identity of a white American person. And it became a coping mechanism for me to be able to deflect all of the feelings of being abnormal, being, like different from everybody else, this idea that I could be American. And it was only as an adult that I realized how much, that scaffolding of my identity is predicated on an entire history of colonialism and racism. Well, not quite an adult. I think I started figuring that out, kind of like in the late part of my childhood. But by then, I think, like it was such a strong coping mechanism to an extent that, for instance, I got here when I was 15, but I have no discernible Filipino accent when I speak English. Like I've become really kind of like a master code switcher in that way, and intuitively, right? And so with the protests and sort of like our entire country reckoning with anti-Blackness and racism, one of the things that I found was I had to really, just sort of, I have so much work to do in order to sort of to figure out and unpack that entire sort of like legacy of the way in which my own consciousness is formed out of this racist ideal. And yet at the same time, that was also a response to the fact that, people like me are usually considered aberrant and abnormal, et cetera, right? So I feel all of that. And then I also have, like this super, super visceral response to the violence, to the police brutality, to all of the things that are happening and have happened to Black people over the centuries, in part because, like Filipinos were Filipinos were called the N-word, through at least the 1930s. We have had a history of being lynched. There have been anti-miscegenation laws that have been proposed, like there are all of these. If you read Filipino American accounts, like America's Not the Heart is probably like the central one. You will read about the ways in which, like the Filipinos were not the model minority until the point when, it became convenient for white people to construct a model minority in order to pit minorities against each other, right? So, so I feel those forces simultaneously and really keenly. So from that perspective, the past couple of weeks have been really hard, and sort of like occupying both of those positions. I think like in some ways there's also I went through a significant period, like maybe like 7 or 8 years when I didn't disclose as trans publicly, like only close friends knew that I was trans. And so I moved through the world as a presumed cis woman. And that also, and I feel that too, like there's a certain correlation between like that feeling of absorbing both when in relationship to women's issues as well, because I'm often in a position where I see the situation both from cis women's and trans women's perspectives. So
it's funny when I know intersectionality is a word that we now use with such abandon that it's almost begun to lose some of its meaning. But if anyone's watching who is still uncertain about what we mean by that word, this is a really good example of what we mean by that word, the ways in which different kinds of difference overlay on top of each other, and different kinds of identities put you either closer to or farther away from normative America. And it's just so I would say fascinating, except that sounds too dispassionate. It's both triumphant and tragic and complex. And is it fair to say that when you were in the Philippines as a child, there you were very visibly different from other people,
absolutely,
members of family, because you were not a brown-skinned person, because you must have really felt really different, in your family, in the country in which you were born,
and continue to be very different from from other members of my family, right? That in certain ways, the way that each of us has been perceived has shaped our experience, right? I give the example of my brother in the book, who unfortunately died in 2005, who as soon as we landed, we were very, like he was always naughtier. He was always, like he wasn't as like nerdy as me, but we certainly were very similar when we got to the States. But immediately he was perceived as Latino and I was perceived as white, and that really shaped our identities and our influences and who we hung out with and who we thought of as role models, et cetera, so that I looked up to this sort of, to this white ideal, and eventually ended up at Harvard, whereas he got involved in gangs and, and ended up in juvenile detention by the time he was 14, right? And that those types of differences are all over, like our family. And one of the really funny things about Filipino people is that we're often perceived as all of these different races, right? Like my dad tends to be more perceived as Chinese or East Asian, a couple of my sisters more Latinx, right? And that racial perception really affects the way that we move through the world in such a racialized environment like the US.
Yeah, I mean, the term passing and passage is so vexed. It's one that I almost kind of hate to use anymore, but it as a kind of handy term for talking about the ways in which people can move through the world, I don't want to say unmolested, but are allowed to move freely among normative society as a result of people perhaps not knowing or misperceiving the truth of their identity. It's really curious. I mean, in my own life, I mean, I'm now, a professor at an Ivy League college, and I'm a white woman, and often, sometimes, generally pass in most situations where people aren't, don't have their trans radar operating. I've been in bathrooms where a man has come into the ladies' room and then seen he was in the wrong place and left, and other women turning to me and saying, "What was that man doing in here in the ladies' room?" And I'm like, I don't know. I've been in places where cis women have turned to me and said stuff about trans women, not knowing that I was one.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, sometimes you get to pass unseen through people who don't know better, and other times, when I've been, usually as a public spokesperson for trans issues, I've been protested. I've had members of the religious right come at me. I've been in situations where I felt really, really unsafe because of who I am. I'm right now, I'm kind of a person of privilege because of, well, in part because I've been grading papers for 40 years. But, my mother was an immigrant to this country, didn't speak English until she was almost 10 years old. And so there are times when I sit back and I think, both because of my mother and also because of being trans, I think, well, yes, I know what it's like to suffer. I know what it's like to be different in this culture. And yet, hello, I'm also a person of tremendous privilege. And in the last month or so, I've really been in a position where I have felt like, I felt these two things. One of which is, now is the time, Jenny Boylan, where you kind of need to listen. And if you're in a situation where it's trans people talking, it's kind of trans people of color who need to have the microphone right now, and not you, Professor. And yet at the same time, I also feel like, well, if I say nothing, that's also wrong, because silence is not what we need either. So in terms of intersectionality, I'm probably not who people think of first when they hear that word, but I think it affects all of us, our relationship to normative culture and our distance from whatever that center point is, and having to appreciate both our closeness and our distance from that.
Yeah, and I also think, it's funny just because my former academic self, wants to parse out this idea of intersectionality and say that there are times when the intersections, feel like they come to a point where the identities are in some sort of harmony, but there are times when they really collide with each other and are in conflict, and at least for me, like, it often feels like one of those like multi-level, like super confusing freeways, right? Because I myself have been like at the crosshairs of a lot of these feelings around like when is a good time to talk, when is a good time to to sort of like discuss our perspective, like to what I am proximate to whiteness but not white, right? Like how do those conversations work? And I think we're all trying to figure that out. And I think as well, and this might be a slightly controversial opinion, one of the things that I notice is that is that when things turn in this country, there tends to be this sort of like, toggle effect, especially like among kind of a white general population, where it's sort of like everything suddenly, kind of like Black and BALE organizations are overrun with donations in such a way that they can't handle it, or or everybody is buying anti-racist books, and which is super super important. But the thing that I ask is are we going to commit to the lasting lifelong change that is necessary for this to happen?
Right. That's the question.
The thing that I've been asking is, how many people who bought White Fragility in the past month will read White Fragility, right? And I think and I don't know the answer to that, but I hope that, close to 100%, because there's a difference between expressing symbolic affinity to anti-Blackness and actually, doing the work of figuring out how, you need to modify your behaviors on a day-to-day basis in order to fully account for it, but also B, account for the fact that anti-Blackness is just at the very, very tip of the iceberg in terms of the ways in which, this country oppresses marginalized people, right? And how do we and when do we make space for that? I was talking to a friend today. I don't know if you know Jen Pasteloff. She's a deaf writer who her memoir on being human just came out in paperback, I think yesterday or 2 days ago. And she has been having a really hard time. She's deaf, and she lip reads. And so the fact that people are wearing masks has been really difficult for her, because she can't, she essentially can't communicate with people in ways that she's used to doing, right? And we were just talking about, and I've, because of the fact that I've been doing all of these events and interviews, because I'm albino, I have very bad vision, and I suffer from eye strain, and my eyes are not in the best shape right now. So we were, just exchanging sort of feelings around what does it mean to, kind of hold disability at this moment, right? Hold other marginalized identities, and that the answer to that is really difficult, right? I think being simultaneously focused and also aware of that what we're experiencing is just a very, very small, cross-section of the gross injustices that this country is experiencing.
As the saying goes, it's a lot.
It's a lot. It's absolutely a lot. Yeah.
So I tell you what, we're at the halfway point, believe it or not. Why don't we pause? I think what we should do in the second half of our time together, and by the way, if you're just joining us, I'm Jennifer Finney Boylan, Professor Jennifer Finney Boylan, in fact. I'm talking with Meredith Talusan. Am I saying your last name right?
In Tagalog, it's Talusan.
Talusan.
Yes.
Meredith, I've been saying it wrong all this time.
No.
Meredith Talusan. Is that right? Talusan?
It's basically, you just pronounce it like Talusan, except you say ta instead of tu.
Talusan.
Yes.
We're talking with Meredith Talusan, who is the author of Fairest, a brand new memoir that is just remarkable. It's an important addition to the, shall we say, canon of transliterature. And you can buy Fairest through Booksmith, booksmith.com. I think there's a link. I'm hoping there's a link in the chat function here. And if there's not a link that'll take you, I'm getting a thumbs up from Booksmith. You can also just go to booksmith.com and you'll find a link to buy not only Meredith's book, but you'll be able to buy it from Booksmith. And there are sponsors here, like all independent bookstores. They are facing hard times. You think it's hard times for authors? It is really hard times for booksellers. So it's great if you buy Fairest or Good Boy, A Life in 7 Dogs, now available as an audiobook by Jennifer Finney Boylan. Ha 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 ha. But it's really important, at least tonight, that you buy it from booksmith.com because we wouldn't be here without them. I tell you what, in the second half of this conversation, we're gonna answer some questions directly from you, those of you who are following us on the Facebook feed, those of you who are adding your comments to the chat function here. So we'll get to that in just a second. I think Evan from Booksmith is going to pop back in later and help to coordinate all that. But first, why don't we hear from this remarkable book and have this remarkable author read to us. So Meredith, I understand you've got a piece queued up for us. Let's hear it.
I do. And I have it on my iPad because when I have bad eyes, I can't actually read my own book.
Right.
But a large print edition is coming out in July.
So what point are you reading from?
I am reading.
No, but I mean the type
from
of stuff.
The end of the first chapter.
But I mean the type itself. Is it 18 point or 24 point? How big?
At this point, it's like huge. I think it's like 20. It's probably like.
Yeah, that's really good. Hang on to that.
So it's from I'm sorry. Yeah, it's from the last part of the first chapter of the book. And the things I think that you need to know are that my grandfather is Lola Burt, who's in America, and that also I was absolutely, as a kid, I was absolutely enamored with a child singer named Lea Salonga, who's gone on to be the voice of Mulan and Jasmine, a big Broadway star. So I think those are the two things that you need to know. My grandfather, Tate Gaudencio, came home one afternoon carrying a large cardboard box from Lola Burt, my other grandfather in America. He took a small knife and leaned over to slash against the many layers of packing tape, then stood up when he was done. "It's for you," he said, as he stepped out of the way. My entire family surrounded me while I opened the box, which reached above my waist. A wondrous smell wafted out even before I looked inside. The scent was clean and fragrant, free from the odor of animals and sweat I'd grown used to in our village. I forgot where I was, lost in the smell of America, dreaming of giant homes and endless toys. When I came back to myself and realized I was still in a small village in the Philippines, my first thought was that I wanted to be wherever that smell came from. My family helped me take out what was inside. There were several bottles of shampoo, which up to then I'd only seen in plastic sachets. There was soap in bright boxes and many pieces of colorful clothes, shorts and collared shirts with an animal on the front. The Tita Jackie, the elder of my two aunts, told me was a crocodile, which meant the shirt was expensive. But I was less interested in those clothes than the heavy presents at the bottom, which I took out one by one. The first was a giant book with a shiny black cover, so heavy that I needed to set it down. I mouthed the title in big letters on the front, Astronomy, and marveled at a picture I recognized as the Earth from outer space. The other book was a collection of fairy tales made of thick, shiny paper and full of color images. The third item was not a book, but another box, and inside was a plastic contraption with a keyboard called a speak and spell, which began to talk when I turned it on. I squeezed into the empty cardboard box and rested my back against one of the walls to play for hours that afternoon and for several days after, with a talking machine that predicted the wonder of America, while that box's fragrance became embedded in my mind, even after I couldn't smell it anymore. And Nanay Coro, my grandmother, finally convinced me to throw the container away. My English learning sped up after I got that box of presents. I discovered the UHF channel that only showed American programs from the Angeles US Army base in Pampanga, the province next to us, and watched it all day, even though I had to constantly adjust our metal TV antenna just to catch the grainy signal. I found a show called Jeopardy, where contestants answered all sorts of questions I didn't understand at first, but was able to piece together over time when I started watching it every day. Facts about the US Constitution, the capitals of the world, and great books I hope to someday read. Though even as my knowledge of English broadened, I still listened to Lea Salonga several times a week, as though her album bridged the world I came from and the one I looked forward to. I'd learned the whole tape by heart. I got a tape of hers and sang songs from it throughout the day, including When You Wish Upon a Star and Rainbow Connection, whose melody I loved and which seemed more tangible to me because I saw rainbows often enough. I loved all the songs in the cassette, though I wasn't as fond of Thank You for the Music as the others, its rhythms more complicated and confusing. I listened to it often enough, but because it was near the end, I was just as likely to skip it and fast forward so I could turn the tape over and start from the beginning. But one day, I lay in our common room, as I often did on idle afternoons, the breeze from under the spaces between the floor's bamboo slats, my relief from the summer heat. I looked up at our high ceiling and observed the holes in the thatch from Maya birds who took the pieces of dry grass to build their own nests. My grandmother would bring workers over to patch up the holes before the rainy season began, but I would be in Manila by then and wouldn't experience that feeling of new protection from the coming monsoons. The TV was on in the background, a show that played songs from America. I vaguely registered that a new song began, its first chord somehow familiar, though not familiar enough to stir me from my rest. But when the first lyrics came on, I'm nothing special, in fact, I'm a bit of a bore, I sat up because I recognized that this must be the original singer of Thank You for the Music. I was halfway across the room, so the images were just blurs to me until I crawled closer and got to my usual spot a couple of feet away from the screen. The singer was part of a band that performed in front of a crowd of young people. Her hair was the same color as mine, her skin and cheeks rosy like other Americans I'd seen on TV. The way the crowd adored the singer, reaching out their hands to touch her, they must have found her beautiful. The way people around me thought I was beautiful. I've been so lucky, she sang. I am the girl with golden hair. I suddenly realized what she meant, that the hair I compared to corn was actually much more valuable, like the gold chain and cross pendant that hung from my grandmother's neck, her most valued possession. I imagined myself as that performer, a golden-haired American woman singing in front of thousands of other Americans who lived in a mansion like in Dallas or Knots Landing. But by the time she sang, "What a joy, what a life, what a chance," a few moments later, I had already returned to my own body, the body of a boy in the Philippines who just happened to have her hair. My future may hold riches, but I would not live it as a beautiful woman. Still, I felt more special after that, more able to withstand the loneliness of being the only one of my kind. Even if I didn't belong with my family, my village, or my country, at least I was lucky to have a future in America where I would lead a wonderful life because my hair was gold, my skin fair. I never skipped Thank You for the Music after that, except I sang Boy with Golden Hair instead of Girl because I was a boy.
Wow.
I hope you recognize that that was a tribute to you and the musical themes of She's Not There.
Well.
Oh, my dog. Hold on one second.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Meredith is just off to get her dog, and she'll be right back. Who we got here? Who we got here? Who are we looking at?
This is Ronnie.
Hi, Ronnie. Schnauzer?
Schnauzer Pitbull.
Schnauzer Pitbull. Holy cow.
Okay, I will lower my camera so that.
Oh, there we go. Oh my God. Hi, Ronnie. Well, if you have a question for Meredith or Ronnie, or even me, why don't you, I see that there are some comments coming in right now. Evan,
mostly about how cute Ronnie is, I'm sure. She's adorable.
So I see a question coming in. Evan, do you want to come in on video as well, or do you want me just to simply channel these questions?
Happy either way. I can pop in.
Hi, Evan,
Hi,
everybody.
hi everyone. That was beautiful reading, Meredith. Thank you. We have a question from Maya. Maya is wondering, I think this is a question for you both. What's the most surprising book to have had an influence on you?
The most surprising book. Let me think about that. I will just name books that have influenced this book, and I don't know which ones are surprising. Let me think. Jamaica Kincaid, definitely. Lucy and Annie Jean. Maybe Andre Aciman's Out of Egypt. People are familiar with Andre Aciman's Call Me by Your Name and his novels, but his first book was actually a memoir called Out of Egypt, which is about his childhood in Egypt, living as a Jewish kid in Egypt and how he got out. That's a big, and also, one other obscure influence is Enfance by Nathalie Sarraute, who is an amazing French author. I think it's translated into English as Childhood. So I was a nerdy French scholar. This is a side of me that people are not really aware of, but I was in a comparative literature PhD program prior to becoming a writer.
Wow.
And I will just, while Jenny answers, I will let my dog out so that she doesn't bother us.
Fair enough. I want to talk a little bit about the broader question of what books say to us and how what they say to us changes over time. But before I answer that, I'll give you some very boring answers. The first book that ever made me cry was Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. The first book that ever kind of just took my breath away and made me only want to live in the world of the book and not live in the world that I was living in was Lord of the Rings, which I was fortunate enough to read at age 15 in 1973. Back when it was just like if you knew about that book, you were a part of the secret underground. The first book that let me know that there were such people as transgender people was a book by a woman named Canary Khan called Canary. It's a book that is I think it's out of print and its author has disappeared. I don't know what became of her, but that was the first book that made me think, oh, I'm not the only one of these in the world. Conundrum by Jan Morris came out in 72, I think. So it was actually before Canary. That was the first book that let me know that not only were there transgender people, but that you could be literary and lyrical. And then Fairest by Meredith Talusan was the book that let me know that the torch has been passed to a new generation, and that the story of who transgender people are and the kind of stories they had to tell is gonna continue. Anyway, having said all that, I think maybe more interesting question is what books say to you based on who you are when you read them, how old you are when you read them, and at what point in history you read them. So just to go back to Lord of the Rings for a second, how lucky was I to read that when I was 15 years old in 1973. It was another 30 years before there were movies to forever make people think that Frodo looked like Elijah Wood. I mean, I lived in those books and they were for me. And maybe a better example is The Great Gatsby, which is a book that I think gets wrecked because we make people read it in high school. It's really a book. There's certain books I think that it's not that you shouldn't read them, but they're not going to speak to you until a later point in your life. So I'd read The Great Gatsby a dozen times before I hit 40 when I was living in Ireland. And then suddenly, and I always kind of thought, no, whatever, the roaring 20s, am I right? But suddenly I was on the verge of transition, and here's a story about the perils of inventing yourself. And suddenly, for the first time, it was like, oh, I'd read The Great Gatsby before, but I'd never read The Great Gatsby. So I don't know, if I read Lord of the Rings now for the first time, and even if I'd never seen the movies, I would think, this is like 3,000 pages of people walking to a volcano, and there's no women really in it. I think it would do nothing for me now. So it's not only the books that move you, it's like when you get them and where you are in your life and what's going on in the world. Did you have that experience, Meredith? I mean, is there anything that you read that you loved that now, if you went back to it, you'd think, what is this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love so much white gay male fiction, like Alan Hollinghurst, Edmund White, like all of those just kind of like, E.M. Forster. And now when I read them, it's so the adoration is diluted because of the fact that they're told from such a white male perspective.
I met Edmund White at a party last year, and all that notwithstanding, it was all I could do not to bow down and wash his feet.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Evan, what else have you got for us?
Okay, next question is from Amanda. Amanda, this question is from Meredith. What was the experience of writing a memoir like? Was it painful, cathartic, something else?
It's both of those things. It was really enlightening. I feel like like different people experience memoir writing in different ways. Like for me, these were periods in my life that were super, super intense, where I didn't have a lot of time to process and understand my motivations and feelings as they were happening. So it has been like a real gift, actually, for me to be given the time and space and money to be able to go back to those periods of my life and really, really distill what I learned from them. And I think writing this memoir has really made me a better person in a lot of ways. I highly recommend writing memoirs from that perspective.
Meredith, did you run into anybody who, while you were writing, told you, oh, you shouldn't write this now, you need to wait a few years, wait till everything kind of settles?
Yeah, the people are always, but also like I look younger than I am, so a lot of people would just be like, oh, like you're too young to write a memoir. And I'm just like, no, I'm just Asian. So
I should being told that I should wait when I was writing She's Not There way back in 2001 and 2. I remember people saying, you've only just gotten through transition. In some ways, you're not through transition all the way at all yet. If there, right. assuming there ever is an all the way, I arrogantly disregarded that counsel, which I mean, and I know what people mean, because I know a lot of transgender people who they're like, oh, I've got to tell my story, I've got to write my book, and I'm kind of like, well, do you have any experience writing? Do you know anything about writing? Right. Which is not, and I don't mean to arrogantly shut down writers, but I mean writing a real story, like a really good story, it's hard. And anyway, all I know is that if I hadn't written She's Not There when I did, I would never be able to write that book now. And I had forgotten so much of what's in that book. And now, every now and then, I'll open that book and I'll look at it and I'm like, oh, right. Oh my God, that was terrible. All that stuff happened to me, Plus, and maybe we could talk about this a little bit, Meredith. I mean, so when I look at She's Not There now, so that's a story of a transition that took place in somewhere between 1998 and 2002, those 4 years, more or less. it reflects the kind of where the culture was at that time, which is to say the trans stuff was really off the radar, and I felt like I had to explain to everybody. And if I look at She's Not There Now, I think there's very much an aroma of it of, oh, I'm so sorry, won't you please forgive me, please understand me, I'm really such a nice person. And there's you know, a lot of the memoirs that I read now are kind of much more fierce in terms of, look, I'm trans, that's the fact, Jack. And, you know, either get on the train or we'll throw you off. And so that's a real change. My question to you is, are you aware of this moment in trans history where Fairest falls in this history? And what do you think the world will be like in 20 years for trans people? And what will Fairest have to say to those people in the future?
Right. I mean, I do feel like, I am aware of that. I'm aware, and in part because I've, over the years, you know, like gotten more comfortable in being in the position of helping to make that world happen, right? You know, like the writing that we've done over the many years that we've been writing, a lot more so, many more years than me, has actually enabled us to be in a position, you know, to enabled writers in general and me to be in a position to say, look, you know, I like whatever cis people think of trans people is secondary to me, right? And I do think that that's a privilege that trans people have not had until recently. And I do think that can get in the way of a particular type of genre of memoir, right? You know, like if you think about quote unquote classic memoir, it's not about the author explaining themselves to, you know, to a public in order for the public to understand them. It's about the author wrestling with these large questions in their life for themselves, you know, because, and in an uncompromised way, not have to reduce or simplify that experience in order for people to, you know, understand them, tolerate them, respect them, et cetera, et cetera. And that was definitely something that I was aware of while I was writing the book. And, you know, that even though, and people have expressed to me how surprised they are how little quote unquote politics there is in the book, given their knowledge of how political I am, right? And my argument is that it's actually the politics of the book not to explicitly engage in politics, because that's not something that you would expect a white cisgender memoirist to do, to somehow, you know, to somehow, like in a memoir that is about their experiences, right?
Let's hear, and let's take me off the table, of course, because of course I go without saying, but who are your favorite trans writers? Can you give us a half a dozen books that you love and you wish people would read? Or have those books?
I mean, you know, like certainly Conundrum, you know, and yes, obviously, like I love your books. I love Redefining Realness. I love Cyrus Denham's new memoir recently, My Year Without a Name, The Year Without a Name. I'm having trouble.
I think it's The Year Without a Name, yeah.
Yeah, Akwaeke Emezi's Freshwater is really amazing. This is now, you know, like in fiction territory. Jody Rosenberg's Confessions of the Fox is super amazing. I love Tori Peters's work. She's publishing her first novel. She's published novellas before, but she's publishing her first novel, which I think is called Detransition Baby from One World, later this year, which I'm really looking, you know, she's like a rabble rouser, and I'm really looking forward to that. And Casey Plett, I love Casey Plett. So
great. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned Casey. Casey, I was so cross with Casey because she reviewed the Caitlyn Jenner show.
Yes.
She did a recap for the Times, the first season when I was on that show, and she was kind of merciless to that show, which I guess maybe was fair in retrospect, but I was always hoping that Casey would give us a little more slack. There was one of her, one of those articles was titled, "You Know Nothing, Caitlyn Jenner," which I thought was awfully on point. I'll mention one more as long as we're cheering for other trans writers. There's a woman named Joy Ladin, Ladin, who wrote a book called Through the Gates of Life. Joy was the first professor to transition at an Orthodox Jewish university. She was at yeshiva, and it's really very much a story about what it means to be trans and to have a spiritual life, a relationship with God. And I'm not Orthodox or Jewish or Orthodox Jewish, but I found the book absolutely amazing and spiritual and beautifully written. So whenever I'm talking up trans writers, I always try to mention Joy Ladin. Hey, let's do one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Evan, are you still there?
Yeah, sure am. I do have a question from Ayat, and the question is, I want to hear about your first experience learning about each other's stories and reading each other's work. What surprised you, and what did you connect most with?
Well, I remember the first time I met you, Meredith. You were at a Penn World Voices event that I was doing with, I think it was a whole panel. Do you remember the event? You were in the audience, and
yeah, I am forgetting what the event was, but
anyway, this is probably like 2 years ago. It might have been 3, and suddenly there was this very I want to say articulate, but I'm afraid articulate is now like a code word for something bad.
Right. Well, you can call me articulate. I'm not Black, so it's okay.
What I meant was really well-spoken, smart, a little bit pointed woman in the front row, and she was like, "Wow, I forget what your question was, but it was one amazingly that I'd not been asked 10,000 times before." And you came up to me afterwards, you introduced yourself, and then I put you together with this person who was the contributing editor at Them. And I'm like, okay. And then I think you interviewed me for them. Actually, for my novel, Long Black Veil, which is right here. Long Black Veil, now available in paperback. Sorry. So that's my first experience of you. I actually had an experience of you as a person before I read your book, and reading your book came afterwards.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that I first read She's Not There during that period when I wasn't really disclosed as trans, right? And I think that it was really affecting for me on multiple levels, because of the fact that I was choosing not to be public about my trans identity at the time, which was lonely, even though it protected me from a lot of, the discrimination came right after I publicly disclosed. But then, similar to the experience that you had with Jean Morris, I was this super, I have always been this super nerdy, bookish person. I was, I had done a fiction MFA. I was in a comparative literature PhD program. And so, seeing somebody who was telling their story, not just because of, the story itself, not just because being trans is something that was newsworthy or something that was eye-catching, but was really exploring the interior of that experience in a way that, in that way that we so love about great literature, was something that really, that really stayed with me and was very much, was very much an inspiration, not just, not just for this book, but just in general, in terms of, having somebody like you in the world, right? Is something that has, that has certainly guided me as a trans person and as a trans writer over the years.
Well, I'll say, just as we get ready to wrap up, pretty soon you're going to be the Jenny Boylan, and there's going to be somebody in the front row of some event that you're going to be doing 10 years from now or 15 years from now. I mean, no, I mean this seriously. If there's one thing that I think, this is my advice to you, if I get to be maternal, as from an older generation to a younger, if you get, I mean, I've already said this to you, but if there's one thing we're compelled to do morally, it is to talk up and support other transgender writers. You know, it is a small world, and publishing a book, any book right now, it is a hard business. So I think we should be in the business of looking out for each other, and particularly looking out for new young writers. I can't tell you how delighted I was to read Fairest. Again, you can order a copy of Fairest from Booksmith.com. There is a link in the chat bar wing thread thing, and you can also find it on Booksmith.com. So Meredith, congratulations on Fairest, and Evan, thank you for having us both here tonight.
And looking forward to hugging you in person soon.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Meredith. Congratulations.
Oh wait, are you still there? Wait, can I keep you for one more second? Are you all still there? Did I just lose you?
Nope.
Maybe, what was the name of the deaf writer that you were mentioning a second ago?
Oh, Jen Pasteloff.
Do you know how to say? Do you know how to? So I'm not deaf, but I'm severely hearing impaired. So I do read lips. And I try as I can to learn ASL. Have you seen the ASL sign for transgender?
No.
Can I show you? Because this is and it's such a cool thing, and there's a little story about it. So it used to be that to say transgender, it was this, which is, so that's the letter X, and X going down across your face is sex. So you take sex and turn it around. That was transgender, and it was this, in a way, there's something. I mean, all the problems with that are so obvious, like sex backwards. And the thing I love about ASL is that it is this constantly evolving lyrical language. So here's the new sign. And so what that is, that's a flower over your heart, over your left breast, and it comes out and it faces the sky. And as it faces the sky, the petals open. And then the petals close as they go back into your heart, with the flower facing the right way. And I know, because you're a literature nerd, I know that you'll like that. So look at that.
I love that.
And to me, it's the thing that we all do. It's not just trans identity, although it is trans identity, but every reader, I think, every human knows what it's like to have something in your heart that can't bloom because it's stuck inside. But you let it out, it blooms, it can go back in your heart in the right way. So to me, that's the evolution that we've been through since She's Not There was published to now when Fairest is published. We've gone from to that, and that is the coolest thing I know. So I thought I'd leave you on that.
So wonderful way to end, Jenny. Thank you.
So peace and love. Thanks, Meredith, and thanks, Evan. Thanks, readers.
Thank you both.
Booksmith.com. You can get Fairest right now. I hope you will.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope we can all gather in person sometime soon. In the meanwhile, take care and be well and fight like hell.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.